I'm delighted to welcome you tonight to this panel on the future of language learning in North Carolina. My name is Kevin Fogg, and I'm the Associate Director of the Carolina Asia Center, and I'm here representing the UNC Duke Area Studies Centers. And in conjunction with the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, we're hosting this webinar for you this evening, and we're so delighted to have a really fantastic panel to guide us through this important topic. If you want to hear more about my co-sponsor, the NC Department of Public Instruction, you can catch them at their website. This is bit.ly/NCDPIWL. That's for North Carolina Department of Public Instruction World Languages. And you'll see some of the fantastic materials there, some of which we'll talk through this evening. If you want to hear more about our work at the UNC Duke Area Studies Centers, you've got all of the links up here now, and we'll flash these again at the end of the program. We've got an African Studies Center, the Carolina Asia Center, which I represent, a Center for European Studies, a consortium across Duke and UNC for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the Duke UNC Consortium for the Middle East. For tonight, our webinar is going to be with 4 great panelists. We have set this up as a webinar, so you will not be heard. You won't be on video if you're joining us as a participant, so don't worry. If you want to kick up your feet and just relax and listen, we won't be able to hear you, we won't be able to see you, but we do hope that you benefit from our discussion. When you have questions, type those into the Q&A feature that you'll see either at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on whether you're using a tablet or a laptop. I need to warn all of you that this webinar is being recorded for asynchronous viewing. Since none of you will be seen or heard, that shouldn't be an issue, but your questions might be read out. If you have questions or problems, you can feel free to contact me, and you'll see my email on the screen there, kfogg@email.unc.edu. Now, it is my absolute joy to introduce our expert panel. As our moderator tonight, we have Dr. Marie Gunter. She's the World Languages Consultant for North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. In addition to her current work for the state, she has experience as a former French teacher. After her, we'll see Professor Kristen J. Davin. She is an associate professor at UNC Charlotte in the Cato College of Education. Although she has a background teaching Spanish, she's coordinating the training of teachers in a wide variety of languages. I think they've got dozens of languages in the Masters of Arts in Teaching program at UNC Charlotte. Next alphabetically is Professor Ana Cecilia Lara, who is coming to us from UNC Pembroke. She's the Director of Foreign Languages and the coordinator of Spanish teacher licensure at UNC Pembroke. And she's also an expert on Latin American literature, cultural studies, and applied linguistics. And last but certainly not least, I am so pleased that Professor L.J. Randolph is joining us from UNC-Wilmington, where he's an associate professor of Spanish and of education, and he's the coordinator of world language teacher education. LJ is such a great panelist to have tonight because he's a leader in thinking about ways to promote social justice in the context of language learning. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Gunter.
Well, thank you, Kevin. We've worked together as panelists to come up with several questions that we're going to share with you, and we'll have different people answering across the board. As we noted earlier, we're also taking your questions, and we'll be tracking those in the Q&A box. So be sure and put those in there whenever you think of them, and we'll pass them along. Let's go ahead and get started with our first question. North Carolina is a national leader in language learning. As a local control state, our schools decide which languages to offer that best fit their community's needs. Currently, 18 different languages are being offered in K-12 schools across the state, and annual enrollment data shows that more students are taking more languages over time. How is language learning evolving for 21st century students? Let's go to Dr. Randolph for a response first to this question.
Make sure I unmute myself. Hi everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here and to chat with you about this important topic and to think about the direction of language education in North Carolina specifically. One part of that question that I love is this idea of local entities deciding which languages best fit their community needs. And I love that idea of thinking about language learning as it relates to community. And so I think of all those languages, those 18 languages that are offered in North Carolina, not as foreign languages or even as world languages, but as community languages that in many cases not only reflect the languages that that the speech communities of our students come from, but they intersect with the speech communities of other students who may not speak that language. So let's say if I teach Spanish or German or whatever, even if I may not have students in my classroom who come from that speech community, they certainly via their day-to-day interaction or online interaction or the media that they consume, whatever, there is some type of intersection with people of that community. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And thinking about the trajectory of learning for 21st century students, we hear that term a lot. And I think the place of the language class in that is that we're recognizing more of the transformative power of language learning, where we're not just thinking about proficiency or sort of these discrete elements of the language. We're thinking about more global challenges and the way that language learning can help students meet those challenges. And it's sort of in line with culturally responsive pedagogy, we're using the language class as a way to increase students' sociocultural and critical consciousness. And through the 5 C's framework of the language curriculum, you have communication, cultures, connections, comparisons, and communities. I think that the language classroom is uniquely situated to really seamlessly embed some of those topics into our curriculum. For example, anti-racism and other social justice related issues, because they matter to our students, and our students are the ones in the future who are going to be the ones addressing these issues and really moving forward with thinking about solutions and leading those solutions to these issues. So I think that it's important to recognize the crucial role that language learning can play in all of that.
Yeah, those are some great points. What do others think about that question?
Well, I think what Dr. Randolph add today to this conversation is the fact of being a community language. I really like how he emphasized on that, because we have in the area that I live, the Spanish community is increasing, and basically incorporate the Spanish and the community into the class, where they can really use not any just a language that comes from the books, but really the language that comes from the community. So integrate exactly what are the languages that have been spoken, what are the countries that have been reflecting in that class. I think that's important, and I really like that as aspect that Dr. Randolph added.
I'll add to that too, in thinking about the community. As 21st century students, our learners have access to communities, all over now through the internet. I know we're going to talk a little bit about technology later on, but connecting to this idea of bringing the community into the classroom and finding, authentic resources, that touch on these topics like anti-racism and social justice that Dr. Randolph mentioned. I'm seeing a lot of use of really great authentic resources, viewing text or reading text in our classrooms, in our language classrooms. So for example, just with this semester, I've had a candidate who created a unit where students were looking at different school supplies at a school in Mexico that they found on the internet, and then comparing that to the school supplies, of their own school. I've had candidates that have found so many great authentic resources through YouTube and through Leslie Grand's, blog and her website about how to find authentic resources. So I feel like as 21st century students, it's getting a lot easier for our teachers, to go out and bring these really authentic and rich resources on a variety of topics into their instruction.
Yeah, it really sounds like one of our themes is, connecting communities and how we're making that happen through language learning. All right, well, let's go ahead and move on to our next question. To start out with, 10 years ago, North Carolina was the first state in the country to adopt proficiency-based world language standards K-12. The student outcomes in our standards describe what students should know and be able to do with the language they're learning when they communicate with others. This includes demonstrating cultural competence when they speak or sign, in the case of American Sign Language, as well as write in the language, and then when they're listening, reading, or viewing. How is teaching and pedagogy changing to support students' language learning needs?
So I'll start again. I think that's important to keep in mind that number one, North Carolina at the state level was the first to adopt this type of curricular model. And then the fact that it happened really only, quote unquote, only 10 years ago. So that's still a relatively short time ago for the first state to adopt that type of model. And so I think in many ways, we're still in this transitional phase of understanding how language learners best develop proficiency. There's still a lot of research about that, a lot of discussion about how that happens. And so I think when I think about our responsibility as language educators is to resist this urge to teach as we were taught, or to even teach in a way that makes sense to us. Because I think as society continues to evolve, as our student populations continue to evolve, our curricula and our instructional practices, and even the resources that we use, Dr. Davin mentioned that earlier about the types of resources that we bring into the classroom, it must reflect also that evolution that we're seeing in our society and with our students. And I think you mentioned proficiency, and I think part of proficiency also is this idea of intercultural communicative competence from Michael Byram. And it's this notion that proficiency isn't, just this abstract learning objective, but it's tied to our understanding of the world and of ourselves. So I don't want to only be able to communicate with someone, but I want to do so in a way that reflects and an understanding of their culture and the ability to use that understanding to communicate effectively. So for example, just to give a practical example of this, if you're looking at the interpersonal and public discourse surrounding certain polarizing or controversial issues, like, open Twitter, or I dare you to look at the comment section of a controversial news article, you'll see immediately that there's a need for developing those types of skills and that type of discourse, and for just our society in general to be able to make those types of connections with people. And so I think developing that level of intercultural competence comes about through deep critical reflection of our own cultures and perspectives and the cultures and perspectives of others. And you'll hear me use, we have language educators on this call, so you hear me use those buzzwords. You have the 3 Ps, the practices, products, perspectives, the cultures, which is one of the 5 Cs. So I say that to just to emphasize the fact that this is very much part of language education. It's not something extra. It's something that's embedded into the very fiber of what it means to be proficient in a language. And part of this question also asked about students' language learning needs, and taking a bird's eye view of that and just thinking about learning needs in general. Students want and deserve to experience schooling. And when I think about schooling, I'm thinking about the curriculum, the instructional practices, the types of relationships that they're going to foster within that environment. They deserve to experience schooling in a way that validates and amplifies their own conceptions of self. So including representation, topics that matter to them, and also in terms of the cultural and linguistic practices that they value, because students really do bring their whole selves to the classroom. They don't have these compartmentalized identities. So they're not just bringing their language learning identity to the language classroom, they're bringing their whole identity, their whole self to the classroom. So how can we tap into that in a way that also promotes language proficiency? I think it's important to think about it as we think about how pedagogy and instructional practices and the teaching profession has evolved and will continue to evolve. And I think one way that the teaching profession has risen to that challenge is the growth and expansion of our professional communities. I think about Twitter chats like Lang Chat, which I love. And then I know that there are lots of different chats that happen at the school level and the district level. More accessible models of professional development. And we're seeing more of that now due to COVID. So I hope that that continues, like webinars, book circles, that kind of thing. And then also I would encourage teachers and challenge myself as well to get more involved as much as possible in those types of communities. So for example, if you're on Facebook, there are various Facebook groups that I'm a member of that I wouldn't, that offer me perspectives that I normally wouldn't have because of the types of teachers that I'm able to connect with through those groups, Twitter and actual special interest groups. So those are just some options.
Yeah, and I remember, Dr. Gunter, when you started with this 10 years ago, you know, and you have been a pioneer in all this process, and that's what we need. We need people like you, you know, to help us to maintain that rigor in the system, you know, because there are the standards, but we have to follow the standards, you know, and there are the standards, and the teachers, when they graduated, sometimes they forget about the use of the second language in the class. It's easier not to use it. It's easier just speak English and, you know, teach the class as a second language as any other regular math or science class. But it's not that the way that we have to teach our foreign language. Our foreign language need to be taught by, with the language that we are teaching in that class, with the target language. So I really invite all the teachers that are listening to us and all the educators to continue growing in that effort, you know, because I know that when they graduate from the college, they went to the classes with the, you know, with that input, with the desire, you know, to do all the changes that they wanted, but somehow in the process, sometimes they forget about it. So I just want them to motivate them and to continue doing it, as Dr. Randolph say, get involved with all the ACFO, get involved with plan, get involved with everything, so we can continue maintaining this in the classroom so the students can get to the proficiency level that we wanted.
In addition to the standards, which have been so helpful, you know, we've also gotten the necessful, actful, can-do statements, which really make it clear for teachers, you know, what students should be able to do, you know, in interpretive, interpersonal, presentational communication at the different levels of proficiency. And so I've really seen a lot of articulation in K-12 world language programs using these can-do statements. They provide a pretty clear path, not only for teachers in their planning and their instruction, but also for learners too, to kind of self-assess where they are, what they can do with the language, and where they're going next. So that's one change I've noticed in teaching and pedagogy that's made, you know, a pretty impactful difference. Another thing too, though, is the research on the core practices that's come out of University of Michigan, and that's been adopted by ACTFL in their 6 core practices. There's also a book by Glisson and Donato focused on those practices. And basically there are these practices that they say, if you can get really good at doing these things in your classroom, regardless of what level or language, you know, you're going to see hopefully, you know, high gains in student proficiency. And so things like facilitating target language comprehensibility, and questioning to build and assess student understanding, fostering interpersonal communication, really kind of proficiency focused practices, along with, you know, teaching culture through dialogic, you know, context, to go back to what Dr. Randolph started us off by saying. So these are some of the changes that I've seen recently in classrooms that seem to be making a big difference.
Great. Yeah, we are very fortunate in North Carolina that we've had proficiency-based standards for so long. And truly that was a team effort when we did that back in 2010. We had a lot of educators at the table. We were looking at all the research, and we felt that that was the natural progression, the natural shift, if you will, to how language education should be, is looking at those proficiency outcomes. And we are getting ready to embark on that process again. Starting in January of 22, we will launch our revision phase and update phase for the state standards. You know, several of you mentioned things like culture and intercultural communicative competence. And that's something that has become much more prominent since we did our work with the standards in 2010. You know, I think about, for example, all that we've learned, you know, particularly about culture and applying that effectively. And there are people who even say we should lead with culture, that teachers should lead with culture in the classroom, and maybe that's the way to reorganize the standards. We've also got, you know, Dr. Davin mentioned the necessitable, actful, can-do statements. Those statements now include not just can-do statements for the communication modes, but in fact, statements for intercultural communicative competence. And so we've got a lot more materials to work with and a lot more research. You mentioned the core practices. I know that Glisson and Donato are coming out with a new book. So there'll be 10 core practices we can focus on as we start to think about our standards. Do any of you want to share sort of what the experience has been like in working with teacher educators or pre-service teachers in your programs as they're making that shift to proficiency-based standards and that intercultural communicative competence?
Well, I'll connect back to what Dr. Randolph started by saying, this idea that we have a tendency to teach the ways in which we were taught. In my program, I have teacher candidates from all over the world who learned languages using very different, you know, with teachers using very different methods. And so we always start out by reflecting on, now, how did I learn language? What did my teacher do? Recognizing that that's going to be my own tendency in the classroom, that if I'm aware of that, then, you know, I can perhaps counteract it and try to focus more on what the standards are telling us, what the can-do statements say, what we know about teaching intercultural competence. So that's something that we always start with in my program.
Well, in my program with the students, they're teaching. I have different cases, but I have one. They really, I like the reflection that he did. He went to the classroom, and at the beginning, he thought it was too difficult. Even this was during his internship. He thought it was too difficult to do it in Spanish and to be using Spanish all the time. And the student didn't understand him, and he was frustrating, you know, and he knew that I was going to observe him, you know, so that he needed to change the way that he was teaching. And he started doing it. And then he started with this reflection saying how much the students progress when he started using the language, and how much he was able to really connect with the students with the target language. So I saw that difference, and I saw that using the standard. He also started using more the I can do statement with the students, as Dr. David was saying, and that was a very helpful tool for them. So yes, I think we're going in the right step.
Just to add on to that, Cecilia, you mentioned reflection, and I think that's key as well in working with pre-service teachers. One of their first assignments in my class is we look at how we all learn languages, and how that how we learn to speak the language that we're going to teach, and what privileges came with that, and what biases are we going to bring to the classroom because of that. Because I think if we can take a critical lens to the biases and the assumptions that we make about language learning in our students, that will help us to transition to be able to develop instruction that will meet the needs of students who are not like us, who are going to represent, you know, different populations than maybe what the populations that we grew up around, or the populations that we had in our classrooms as we learned the language. So.
Yes, and it's all that kind of diversity is always something to consider, you know, and as we mentioned before, right now we teach 18 languages in North Carolina. That's a lot. It's a lot of different perspectives and things to consider. when we think about language teaching and how it should be for our students. Our next question kind of has to do with that. North Carolina has 5 what we call more commonly taught languages, which are languages that have annual enrollments of about 5,000 students or more. And those languages right now are Spanish, French, Chinese, Latin, and German. The other 13 languages are considered less commonly taught languages, but they're steadily growing and more are going to be added soon. What changes are happening with less commonly taught languages like Arabic, Japanese, and Russian? Dr. Davin, would you like to share first?
Sure. So we've seen an increase in offerings and enrollment in these less commonly taught languages. So if you were to go to the NC DPI World Languages website, which there was a link to on an earlier slide, you'll find an infographic about all the different languages taught in North Carolina. And according to that graphic, we had in the 2018-2019 school year, approximately 1,500 students enrolled in Japanese classes, 300 in Russian, 200 in Arabic. We also have Greek, Italian, indigenous language, Cherokee, and Urdu programs here in North Carolina. What's really exciting on top of all of this is the increase in dual language immersion programs in the state, in which content, math, science, social studies, for example, are taught in the language other than English for part of the day, or in some cases all of the day. So we have, over 200 dual language immersion programs in 8 different languages in our state. We have Spanish, Chinese, French, German, Japanese, Cherokee, Greek, and Urdu dual language immersion programs. And so that really sets us apart from many different states. One thing that Anne-Marie or Dr. Gunter mentioned earlier is that North Carolina is a local control state. So districts and charter schools can decide which languages they're going to offer based on their community's needs and requests, which is really critical. Because if I live in a community, for example, that has a high population of Russian speakers, then that's a language that I should really be, teaching in my school, for example, and I can start a program in that language. Another great resource we have here in North Carolina is NC Virtual Public School, which offers high school and middle school language courses. And I believe it's 8 different languages, including American Sign Language, Japanese, for example, and Arabic. And so those classes are open to students, across the state, which is really, increasing accessibility to less commonly taught languages. Another development that's happened recently in the state, we have a lot of great Star Talk programs in the state. So these are grant-funded programs that promote the teaching and learning of less commonly taught languages. And so there's been, a lot of teachers in our schools who've been able to get professional development through those programs. About a year ago at UNC Charlotte, we worked closely with Dr. Gunter to expand, and NC DPI, at large, to expand our teacher licensure program at the university to offer certification of world language teachers in all languages licensable in the state. So we added languages such as Arabic, Japanese, Russian. We have our first Cherokee teacher candidate. American Sign Language teacher candidates. And before the program began to offer a pathway to licensure for those teachers, there really weren't many options in North Carolina, or weren't options for licensure. And so this has allowed us, one, to create a pathway for those Star Talk teachers in that program. They get credit, through our university if they come to UNC Charlotte after completing that program, which is great. But also we have a lot of opportunities now to certify more teachers in less commonly taught languages, so that everyone has a pathway to licensure.
Excellent. And one thing that I can add to that, Dr. Devin, is the basically students are receiving from K to 12 those less common languages, but sometimes when they come to universities like UNC Pembroke, that is a small university. Well, it's not that small, it's a university, but we don't have that many languages offering in the campus. We are we have this association with the UNC Language Exchange, we are teaching all those languages. So if a student come from different school that they have received already some type of Japanese or we do offer Chinese, but any other language, sometimes or they want to complete a minor in French or Italian, any other language that they have received before, they can continue, you know, even in our university and all the UNC system, because we are all connected, okay, teaching those language in the exchange through online or through face-to-face video conference. So I think that we really have a very good support in the upper levels universities right now.
And the only thing that I would add is for schools and communities that are considering, you know, building their programs and adding some of these less commonly taught languages, to really consider two things. Number one, the pathway that students will take. So start with the end in mind. You know, if I offer a, I don't know, a Mandarin class, what will the pathway be for that student? How can I ensure that by the time that student gets to the third year, that there'll be a class for them to take? And we take into consideration things that just happen, like attrition and funding and scheduling and that type of thing. So just making sure that those programs have the resources that are available. When I taught high school and I was chair of our language department, we offered 6 languages. So we had French, German, Mandarin, Japanese, Latin, and Spanish. And the biggest part of my role, I think, was just the advocacy, making sure that that those teachers felt supported and that there was a clear pathway to sustain those programs, so that those students will have the same, the students who took Japanese, for example, will have the same opportunities and the same curriculum available to them as students who took a language like Spanish or French.
Yeah, those are all good points. And we are, as we're getting in this next question, going to start thinking about how linguistically diverse North Carolina really is, because that's something that brings its own opportunities. We do have many languages across North Carolina. The Home Language Survey that's done every year shows that over 300 languages are spoken in K-12 students' homes across the state. And it's important to consider how we support those students in becoming bilingual and biliterate with their first, or sometimes called, heritage languages. So how might language programs support the language maintenance of heritage communities in North Carolina, like, for example, Chinese or Spanish or Urdu or Vietnamese, let's say, perhaps through initiatives like the Seal of Biliteracy or other opportunities?
Yeah. Thank you.
Dr.
So
Davin?
this is such an important question. You know, we have a history in the United States of subtracting students' first language when they get to school. So, you know, the emphasis becomes so focused on English that, you know, a recent report by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences found that by the third generation, students are often, or children are often no longer speak the language, their heritage language. And so that's problematic. But there have been some initiatives recently that are trying to counteract that. So we've got the dual language immersion programs in North Carolina, which are really important toward, you know, adding languages instead of subtracting them and taking them away. But another initiative that I've been following really closely is the Seal of Biliteracy. So this is an initiative. I'm going to set my little timer here so I don't talk all day about this. But this is an initiative that came out of California, and it was passed in legislation there in 2011. And what it is it recognizes students who graduate from high school biliterate or multiliterate, I should say. So with the ability to read, write, speak, listen in English and an additional language. And it originated there from a group of advocates who wanted to change deficit views around biliteracy. So they saw way too many students who were embarrassed that they spoke another language at home, or monolinguals who thought that it was a deficit rather than an asset to speak another language. And they thought, well, this is hugely problematic. We need to change these perceptions. And so they said, when a child graduates high school, or when a student graduates high school, let's recognize and award them for this proficiency. And so since that time, that policy has been passed in 40 states, including North Carolina. It's called the Global Languages Endorsement here. It's available to high school graduates across our state who demonstrate proficiency in English and another language. Here in North Carolina, if a student takes through level 4 of a language, then they can earn the seal of biliteracy if they also meet the English requirements. But we know that not all languages are taught in schools. A lot of less commonly taught languages, students might not have access to 4 levels of that language. So there are other pathways so that they can earn the seal of biliteracy or global languages endorsement as well. So they can take a proficiency assessment such as the APPLE or the STAMP test. They can also apply for competency credit through North Carolina, in which they demonstrate their proficiency in another language through a process set forth at their school. Part of this that's been really promising, or that we've seen a lot of great work around, is that, you know, we have a lot of community organizations in North Carolina and weekend schools or after school schools where students go to, you know, to learn and to practice their heritage language. And so students at these organizations too can take, you know, a proficiency assessment or demonstrate their proficiency in these languages to earn the seal of biliteracy, which offers a great way to connect, you know, students in our public or charter schools with students who are taking courses at those organizations and weekend schools as well. So just thinking back about this question, how can language programs support maintenance of heritage languages? I think the Global Languages Endorsement Seal of Biliteracy offers a really great way to applaud students for their multiliteracy.
Yes, basically, I don't have nothing to add to that. You covered everything in that question, but I just think that we need to have some type of program that we can educate or reach out the parents, the guardians. Okay, I think that we need to maintain the communication with them and to let them know that it's okay to speak their language, that they need to maintain their language at home. You know, the first language is important. They will learn the English when they go to school, you know, but maintain their language is the most important. And there's still some misconception about it. So I think that we need to insist on that topic.
And the only thing that I would add to that, this question, when we're thinking about language maintenance and heritage communities, it makes me think about the realities of a lot of school districts and how, for example, even Spanish, you take the most widely spoken heritage language in North Carolina, a lot of schools just simply don't have the resources in order to have specific heritage language classes. And so often they're included in classes that were developed for second language learners. We call them mixed classes. And so I think what we need in our profession is a perspective shift with the way that we develop those types of classes. And it's as simple as thinking, you know, what if from the ground up, we develop those courses with the understanding that heritage language learners would be integrated in those classes from the beginning, rather than sort of being a curveball that throws off the learning experience once they enter the class. So I would just encourage school districts and universities that if they don't have the resources or even the student population to have a full heritage, a full track of heritage courses or native speaker courses, to take a step back and globally look at their curriculum and to think what would it look like if we develop learning experiences for these students at the inception of the course, from the very design of the course.
Yeah, those are all good points because, you know, we do have a lot of students coming to us already with a language other than English, and that's an asset. That's an asset for them as individuals. That's an asset for us as a learning and teaching community. And it's really something to consider when we think about the future that they're going to have, already being bilingual and hopefully biliterate if they've had an opportunity to develop reading and writing skills, which is often what our heritage language classes really focus on. So there's a lot to consider there, and certainly our seal of biliteracy and other things like that champion students' bilingualism and biliteracy in a way that we haven't had before. So it's a unique opportunity. And I think Dr. Lara is right. We need to educate others more on that, particularly parents, about that opportunity so that students can take advantage of it. Well, let's move on to something that was mentioned earlier, technology. Language educators have been using technology for many years to bring the world into their classrooms. Sometimes that was to provide authentic resources for students. Sometimes it was to connect with partners around the globe. They've also used technology as a tool to motivate students and to streamline learning, like through flipped classrooms. We mentioned earlier that NC Virtual is, first of all, nationally recognized for the online courses they provide in our schools, but also that they have so many offerings in world languages. World languages is one of the largest departments at NC Virtual, and they have added a new language this year, so they're actually offering 9 of our 18 different languages through high school credit courses there. And as we discussed, that means that sometimes our less commonly taught languages are really reaching a lot more students than they might if they were only taught face-to-face. And now, of course, with the onset of the pandemic in the spring, technology has taken on a whole new dimension in K-12 education. Whether it's with remote instruction or blended or hybrid learning environments, we're using technology in new ways. So how is technology impacting language learning and teaching across different types of communities in urban, suburban, and rural areas in our state? Dr. Lara, do you want to answer that first?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Gunter. Well, really, we know, as you mentioned, we know the technology is being with us and is being helping us. And thanks to technology is that we're being able to reach out to the world, and to bring the knowledge to the students, and also to bring the culture component that sometimes we cannot bring to the classroom, but it's thanks to technology that we're being able to do it. And to make more comprehensible, the input comprehensible into our students, to be able to, for them to understand what is it that we're talking about when they see it, when they see communication and everything with the technology. And when we're referring to technology, we're going to refer also to not just to the hardware, but also the software that we're going to be using, because if we know a little bit about the evolution of the language and how the language is being, the teaching of the language is being through the centuries, well, not centuries, but through the time, is being always alongside with the technology. When they start with the teaching languages a long time ago, they start with the recording, they start with the labs, computer labs. Then we go and pass with the projectors, anything. But technology has been always there to support the teaching of the second language. But now, technology, before the COVID, we already went to the point that we have these great platforms with the avatars already, with the, with the games in the classroom, with the Kahoot, many different platforms for the education and to motivate the students to participate in this learning process. So that was something that started over there and that we already have, and we are advancing, as you say, virtually before the COVID. And somehow was, even though was there for everybody, not everybody got this advantage that we have in the 21st century, because the rural schools didn't have it, okay? Basically, even 2 years ago, there were many schools around my area where I work that didn't have computers, or they didn't have the smart board but not that they didn't have in the classroom because, or in the school, because some schools did have it, but they didn't think, the administrator didn't think the world language was in need of it. You know, we are not being in the priority of the administrators. You know, first is science versus math, and we are not there. We're just like we are there, but we are not as important as other assignments, you know, or other classes that they need to take. But I think that after the COVID, this has changed a little bit. Because again, before the COVID, rural didn't have it, maybe urban or semi-urban, they have it, but they didn't have it in the classroom. Probably in the urban schools, they have it in the classrooms, but not in the house. Maybe in the house, they didn't have the covers, or maybe in their house, they didn't have the computers to continue with the assignments. But after COVID, somehow something good has happening to our students. You know, it's not everything is so bad, you know, because COVID is bringing us many bad issues. But the education system of North Carolina has been able to label, basically leveling all the accessibility that the students now have. The rural schools are being able to get computers or Chrome devices or any type of device for the students to take home. They also been putting some hotspots in the rural areas where they can reach out to this component. So this was something that didn't happen before, and I don't think that would have been happen if we did not go to a crisis like we have done, you know. So I think even though now it's a different situation that we had to motivate the students through the screen, you know, that we had to motivate everybody, and also the parents, we also need to work with the parents to teach them or to help them understand how this has been changing. But I think I can see the light. I can see that something is changing, and I think that we are not going to go back, okay, to what we had before. I think this has to be a point to just go forward with education and go forward to bring this technology to the students that they have right now. Yeah.
I'm interested. One of the points that you made, Cecilia, about access to resources and how that is changing. I think that's a good point. And I think there's still a long way to go. I'm from rural North Carolina, and I remember just a few years ago in my home community, the internet, the Wi-Fi just really, really slow and really inaccessible. And I think things have changed a little bit now, but there's still many communities out there who aren't able to participate as seamlessly in online learning as other communities. You know, just even having to go to a hotspot, that's a huge burden, because then you need transportation, all these other, you add all these other additional resources that the students need. And so, yeah, I'd be interested in hearing from any of the participants. Maybe if you could put it in the chat, and then we could share it with the rest of the participants. If you have any ideas or resources for people who are coping with that, or if there's support groups out there, like via Twitter or something like that. But yeah, that's the only thing that I would add. And I think even outside of the 18 languages that are taught in our state, when you think about the possibility of technology, it expands that even farther. At my university, I advise students who take languages throughout the United States and really throughout the world virtually. So that they're able to take advantage of language learning opportunities that aren't even available in our state, even though we have so many options here. And also, I think with COVID and with everything going online, it's helped change the narrative a little bit. I think with language educators in particular, this is purely anecdotal, so you may or may not fall into this. And I taught online, so I understand even before COVID. So I understand the instructional shift that you have to make. But I think many of the language educators that I spoke to before COVID, they were quite reticent about the notion of teaching online. There's no way that a language class can work online. You're kidding me. That's impossible. And now that we are all in this situation, I think instructors are seeing, wow, I can actually build meaningful relationships with my students virtually. There are many advantages to working online. If it's asynchronous, for example, everyone gets to participate. Everyone has the opportunity to engage to the fullest extent, which may not have been the case if you were teaching face-to-face with limited time for interaction with students. And so I think the narrative of online education and the investment in making it better, all of that is shifting in a positive way.
Yeah, wow. I mean, and thinking about both sides of this, I was watching on the news this morning, or maybe it was another morning this week, that there are so many kids in our country who haven't been seen in school yet this year, or who are receiving failing grades because of distance learning, and not having, access to the technology that they need. And that is absolutely devastating. It's important that people are realizing this, that there's a light being shined on that inequity, so that that's something hopefully that we can work to improve, or that there's change in that area. But I'm really worried about those students. On the other hand, one thing I've noticed is a lot of my former teachers who have never been able to attend conferences in the past because they weren't able to get away from school or didn't have the funding to go, have had access to a lot of amazing professional development this year. For example, the Flank conference registration was much less expensive than in the past because it was a virtual event. Mm-hmm. And then after the conference, as of this past Friday, all sessions from the conference were recorded and are available. And so rather than, just having 2 or 3 days of excellent learning, you have access to these, for several weeks. And so there's a lot of, positives happening there in terms of access to professional development for teachers. So the pandemic has definitely, brought attention to many different ways that technology can be either an extreme hindrance or of really great benefit.
Definitely, lots of good points here, and thinking about technology, not only for language learning in the classroom, but for professional learning for our teachers as well. A whole nother dimension to consider. Well, as we're looking at our time and getting ready to wrap up, we come to our last question before we move to our Q&A. And we've talked a lot tonight about the needs of our language learners and how schools and educators are working hard to address those needs and move education forward. But for each of you, I'd like to ask, what is one change that you want to see in language learning and teaching that would ensure our students are economically competitive global citizens?
Yeah, I would like to respond to that question.
Okay.
First and foremost, I would like to see a change in attitude within the administrative heads or leaders of education in North Carolina regarding the needs of inculcate the second language learning in every single student. Okay, I think that we need to articulate from K to 16, okay, the language, the second language over here in North Carolina. We are being a leader in foreign languages, and we need to continue to do this. We cannot stop now. Basically, they have so many immersion programs across North Carolina, but there are some counties that they already have a wonderful program that they start from elementary, they go to middle school, and they've been growing, articulating the learning of the second language. But very sad to see that change when they go to the high school. They don't continue to that. And then when they come to the university, we also don't continue with that. And all the universities have the requirement in the general education of the language as something important that they need to have. I would like to see everybody to have a second language degree, a bachelor with a world language degree that they can help in the career. But if that is not possible, and if they come to Pembroke, it will be a Spanish bachelor degree. But if that is not the case, I would like to see that they're using their second language or the world language that they are learning into their careers that they want to pursue, like in a very practical careers. Like in Pembroke, we offered before the business Spanish for business, Spanish for business purpose, or Spanish for medical purpose. In the fall, we're going to offer the criminal justice, Spanish for criminal justice or military field. So basically, the fact that the student can use the second language in their career is going to give them that opportunity to be competitive, global citizen compatible, to be very much, to be and in at the same level to other countries, at the same level with the world, because sometimes we are not producing what we need. Even though we are a leader, we are not there yet. So North Carolina needs to remain as a vanguard of the language learning, and also need to put a fair position our students to implement that requirement, not just for the K-12, but also for the higher education, to make a requirement for the general education for them to continue. I think that is the change that I want to see.
Okay. What about?
I'm going to absolutely underscore everything that Dr. Lara just said. I mean, ideally, if we had a K through 16 articulated sequence of study for our students, when you look at the European Union, students are, supposed to graduate high school after having learned 2 additional languages to their home language, and they have much longer sequences of study, and I really admire that. But I'm going to take this opportunity to jump back to the seal of biliteracy. So just going back to that, there are now 4 states where any student who graduates high school with the seal of biliteracy earns college credit at state colleges and universities for having that recognition. And this can open up doors to college access to many students who might not have had that access before. So if you think about, let's think about our emergent bilingual learners, which is an asset-based term for students who are still receiving ESL, English as a Second Languages services. So those students' high school schedules, for example, might be, consumed by ESL courses. They might not have room in their schedule to take a world language, or they might not have room in their schedule to take advanced placement courses. So they're at a disadvantages to other students who are able to go ahead and start working on college credit in high school. But if we can award students the seal of biliteracy, recognizing their multilingualism in high school, and then they go to a college or a university where they will automatically get some credit for that recognition, that makes college more affordable to them and also more accessible. And in some recent research, that I've been doing, what I found is that, many language departments I spoke to were afraid that if students got credit for the seal of biliteracy, that their enrollment would go down, that they wouldn't have as many students taking their world language classes. But from the universities that are doing this, what I found is that they're actually seeing enrollment go up, because students are already halfway to a minor in the language by having earned the seal of biliteracy or global language endorsement. And therefore they think, well, one, they already love the language, and they think, well, I'll take a few more classes and go ahead and get that minor. So that's something that I really want to advocate for, and I would love all of your help with, is getting that seal of biliteracy recognized by our state university and colleges and private institutions, as well.
And we do kind of have a related question about that in the Q&A. So maybe it'd be a good time to check on that question. Dr. Davin mentioned that, we have had the seal of biliteracy in North Carolina now for about 5 years, since 2015, the class of 2015. And that system is automated. So when students earn that recognition, it actually goes directly onto their transcripts. The world language that they're earning it in and the proficiency level that they've earned it in is on their transcripts as they go into the university environment. And so we are hopeful that some of our state campuses will start recognizing that and giving students credit for their seal of biliteracy, or what we call our global languages endorsement. But one of the questions in here had to do with the seal of biliteracy, and they were specifically asking, how are schools advertising that, or how are they celebrating that? And maybe even a better question would be, since it's already automated, we know students receive it, what are schools and districts and even universities doing to recognize that in a way that sort of showcases students' achievement in languages? So Dr. Davin, you kind of want to address that, because you probably hear a lot about that in your research.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've found that it seems like, as much as you shout it from the rooftops and put it in school newsletters and talk about it at conferences, there's still a lot of people who don't know that this exists. There's still a lot of kids who are earning a global languages endorsement in North Carolina and don't realize it. They don't notice it on their transcript or know that they're getting it. So different things that your schools can do. Some schools will give students a special cord to wear at graduation as an indicator that they received it. It might be printed in the program at graduation. I've seen schools do really beautiful ceremonies where they invite the parents of the students who earned that for a special, night, obviously not during COVID. But there's a lot of great ways that you can recognize students who've earned this seal. One thing that I love that, folks in Missouri are doing is they're getting letters from businesses who are headquartered in Missouri saying that they know what the seal of biliteracy is, they support it, and they welcome, applicants to their company that have a seal of biliteracy. That's a really great a way to go. One additional point that I wanted to make related to recognizing students with who've earned this seal of biliteracy is that, for some students, this might be the first time that they've really been celebrated and recognized in school. A colleague just told me a story about a parent who called the world language coordinator and said, "Are you sure my son is supposed to have this award? My son, doesn't get awards." And so it just, that particular anecdote just really got me, because it showed how impactful this can be, and how in my conversations with students, how it can help them take pride in their language and their culture and their heritage. And so I think we do need to find ways to advertise this, inform more families about it, as Dr. Lara said earlier, inform more community organizations, businesses, colleges, universities, students, just everyone about this possibility.
Dr. Randolph, what's the one change you've been thinking about for language teaching and learning that you'd like to see?
Well, and let me, thanks, Kevin, for posting the questions in the chat, because that helps me to stay focused here. I think, I want to say this is going to be a very LJ answer. I agree with the idea of learning a language in order to be economically competitive, like the question states. I think that's important. And I think that's a great goal to move towards as we think about language programming, and we think about how to get students to be proficient, how to recognize students who have gained that proficiency via the seal of biliteracy and other initiatives. However, I guess one change that I would want to see is what about the students, a focus on the students who may not become proficient in the language, because I think that represents the majority, or I know that represents the majority of students who study a language in the United States. So we have this idea of marketplace ideologies that, you learn a language to be competitive in the marketplace. but a study about a decade ago by Friedman, he found that 18% of the US population report speaking at least one additional language. And that compares to about 25% in Canada and over 50% in Europe. However, less than 1% of American adults are proficient in the language that they studied in a US classroom. So I think if proficiency is our only goal, if we're only concerned about proficiency, then there's a serious disconnect to the reality of the lives of the students who are in our classrooms. And I think at the program level, we need to work on that. We need to work on better pathways, like K through 16 pathways, so students can achieve that proficiency. And also, in the meantime, we need to think about what about those students who are in our classrooms right now, in the meantime, who aren't going to be proficient in the language? How can we make language learning meaningful for them? And what other experiences, what other lasting experiences can we provide them with in a language classroom? For example, I think about my own context. At my university, most students have to take the equivalent of third semester of a language in order to graduate. And so in my class, a large number of students are seniors who sort of waited until they were about to graduate to complete that language requirement. So this will be the only language class that they take. They're not going to be able to move forward with their language study, at least not in the university context. And oftentimes, since they waited so long from high school, there's usually a huge proficiency gap in what they're able to do with the language anyway. And so I'm always thinking about what types of transformative experiences I can provide those students who are in my classroom, while also focusing on the proficiency of the other students who are enrolled. And just a quick anecdote, I think about Aaron Schlossberg. You may have seen this viral video. It went viral maybe like in 2018, a couple of years ago. He's a lawyer in New York. He was in a deli and he heard people speaking Spanish, and he just went off on this racist tirade, like, why are you speaking Spanish? This is America, you should be speaking English. And this is in New York City, mind you, where it wouldn't be out of the ordinary at all to see someone speaking Spanish out in a public space. But when you do more research on Aaron, you'll find that he's a lawyer, and not only is he a lawyer, but on his website for his company, his law firm, he promotes the fact that they are a multilingual law firm, right? So here you have someone who sort of recognizes the practical linguistic importance of multilingualism, but from a marketplace perspective, but has no understanding of or sensitivity or compassion towards the people who actually speak those languages, and nor of the actual context in which those languages exist, right? So I think about how we can sort of merge those two experiences together. Yes, there's research that supports the idea that if you're fluent in a language, you can earn more money than if you are not fluent in another language. But there's also this personal transformation piece, and there's research to support that as well from language study. It can help you to become more empathetic, more compassionate. It can increase your interpersonal relationships with people who may not have the same experiences or the same culture that you have. So I think all of those goals are important as well.
Definitely being an effective communicator in all situations and being culturally competent in the way that you do that is critical for success in both professional and personal lives, and something for us to consider. All right, well, we've all got to talk about our one change, and so I'm going to go and turn to some of the questions that have come up in the questions box to see what we can add to the thinking on those. One of them has to do with this K-16 continuum that we've started talking about here. And one person wants to know, are college level courses embracing language acquisition and proficiency levels and that kind of thing in their teaching, or are they still teaching languages through what this person calls legacy methods?
No, basically in our campus, basically when they already come with some Spanish, knowledge that they can be in the intermediate level, or if they already have taken the Spanish classes, so they are coming from the Hispanic background, they can also take the CLEP. So they will give them 12 credits to move forward. And then with those 12 credits, they can start with the classes that goes directly for the minor. And basically in those classes, the students are ready, they are not learning like a, legacy way, no. It's more directly into how to use the language to communicate purpose, how to use it in a really modern way, how to use it with the things that we need to do, a practical way, basically. And when we communicate, like the conversation class, it's not something that they are just going to repeat. No, we are in classes with the TV news, with the whatever happened in Colombia. Let's see what's happening in Colombia. Let's interpret it. Let's talk. Let's debate. So basically, the students are very involved with today's living and today's education with the language.
And a question kind of related to that, but more focused on things like motivation and learning through technology. One person wants to know, are students less motivated right now that they're learning from home and learning through a screen? And is there less pressure, for example, on meeting the standards and meeting outcomes, or not? What do you see and hear about that?
Well, at the university level, again, I don't teach in a language department. I'm in a college of education. My teacher candidates are incredibly engaged and motivated, but they're studying to be teachers. They want to be teachers. They've chosen to be there. And so this has been a great opportunity for them. They don't have to come to Charlotte. They don't have to live in the area to get education. With that, so hearing from is that this is very challenging for our own K-12 students. As I mentioned before, there's students who, consistently aren't in class, or, there's one of my candidates telling me about one of her students who has 4 siblings and they all share, one laptop. And so they're experiencing, a lot of challenges related to language teaching. From some of my teachers who are submitting, videos for different projects, some of them it's amazing what they're able to do. The resources that they have access to in the school and that their students have access to, it seems, like they are very much continuing, along with their language education and making a lot of progress, but it's really highlighting the inequity in terms of the different schools where my candidates teach.
To answer, I wonder, is this Isaiah Bryant from UNCW? I wonder, I don't know. He's a graduate student in our, that's a common name, so it may not be the person that I'm thinking it is. Send a message in the chat if that's you. But sorry if I'm choppy, by the way. I just got a notification saying that my internet connection is unstable. But I don't know if I would say that students are less motivated. There's just a lot more going on, right? My own productivity, it's not that I'm less motivated, but just my own investing in my classes, my research, et cetera, and other elements of life as well, because of COVID and because of what we're all dealing with has shifted. So I don't know if this semester, this year is a good year to gauge, what type of motivation people have. One thing that I will say, working with students online or in any context really, is everyone loves to be successful. Everyone wants to be successful. There's no one where you'll hear them say, I don't like the feeling I get when I'm successful. No one wants to fail. Everyone wants to be successful. So I try to operate from that perspective that we all are trying our best. Our students are trying our best. And we're in a pandemic, and nothing about this is normal. And so with all of that in context, I would say that, I'm actually more often than not surprised at the amount of students who are able to go above and beyond what I would expect during these times. So I found from my own experience that there are more people who are doing more than what's expected, even during these difficult times.
I just want to add a little bit something over here. Yes, as you say, I don't know if it's that they're motivated or they are not motivated. It's hard to know that because there's so many things going on in their life. But and the fact that the K-12 teacher cannot, at least not around the area that I know, they cannot ask the student to put the camera on, and I think that is something very destructive for the students, because if the camera is not on, they can do whatever they want. We have the name over there, but we don't know if they're engaged. So how can we as an instructor can be able to help them, So I think that's something they make the difference, because again, I am at the university also, but I have my students who are teaching the high school, and he start offering points, no points, but extra credit or extra something if their camera was on. So you can see that those students with the camera on were more engaged, in the classes. And of course, the internet sometimes is not good enough, because if you don't have a good connection, you cannot put the background, or if not all the laptops are going to allow you to put the background. So some of them don't want to show where they are, the places that they have. So there are many things going on, but I think it will be a little bit better if we could have the camera on.
Yeah, there are a lot of things going on right now and a lot of challenges to how we best reach students and make sure they're learning and support them in what they need. So a lot to consider. We have a couple other questions that have come in related to some of our previous topics. One of those is a student who comes to you speaking a dialect of a language. Let's say, for example, obviously with like Arabic and Chinese, there are many dialects of those two languages. And the typical dialect that's taught, for example, Chinese is Mandarin, but there are many varieties of Chinese that are not necessarily Mandarin. So how do you help students, or how could a teacher help a student who speaks a dialect like that that's really much less known even than a less commonly taught language, let's say?
If I can start this, just to open the question. I cannot tell you with the Mandarin or with the other language, but I can tell you with the Spanish, because sometimes they come with different dialects of the Spanish, And remember that we have 21 countries where they speak Spanish as the first language. And what I do in my classes and what I ask the students, I used to teach 10 years in the high school. So I also did the same thing, is to incorporate those questions, those words that they use, to incorporate the way that they use it. I think that one of the mistakes that some of the professors, teachers make sometimes is to assume that those are not really language, or that that's not the way that they should be communicated. I think that we have to embrace that language. We have to embrace the language that the student bring, and that's a diversity, and that's empower our class, and that's enrich our class. So basically what we need to do is to teach the other students, these other ways the language is being spoken in Puerto Rico, in Mexico, in Argentina, in El Salvador, the use of the voz in Central America versus the use of voz in Argentina, the use of tú, things like this. I think it will enrich our classes, and we need to learn to put it together.
I echo that. Thanks, Cecilia. One way that I try to do what Cecilia is talking about in my own classes is I choose, it goes back to resource selection. I intentionally choose resources that represent marginalized perspectives and also stigmatized varieties of the language. And we study those from an academic perspective to show that it's not just the things that you read in the textbook, or it's not just the classic peninsular Spanish literature that's worthy of academic study. All of these perspectives are worthy to be incorporated into the classroom and to be studied and critiqued at an academic level.
I was doing some research on the seal of biliteracy and conducting focus groups with kids in high school, finding out what made them decide to either take the proficiency assessment to get the seal of biliteracy or not take it. And it was really interesting. Some of the students who I spoke to, I'm thinking of a particular Spanish speaker and a Hmong speaker who had chosen not to take the test to get the seal. And I asked them why they chose not to take it. And they said, oh, well, you know, I wouldn't have passed that test. And so, you know, as I interviewed them more, you know, it came out that the girl, for example, was the TA for the Hmong teacher in the high school. The boy used Spanish on a very regular basis, you know, in his job. It was very clear that they were proficient in these languages and would have earned the seal of biliteracy. And so I asked them, you know, a little bit more, you know, why do you think you don't speak the language? And I remember the boy saying, oh, well, when I took Spanish class, like I never put my accent marks in the right place. And I never could remember when it was like 2 L's together or just 1 L. And, you know, I just did really poorly in the class. And, you know, it was clear that I didn't speak Spanish. And so I say this story just to remind us all as teachers that being sticklers for different things like that, or not even just that, but not embracing students' dialogues and the uniqueness of the language that they bring to the classroom can have such profound impacts that can last for so long, and really shape the identities of our students. And so just being aware as educators how much power we have that we might not, you know, realize we have. So underscoring what Dr. Lara and Dr. Randolph said in terms of embracing all dialects and making students realize how special those are.
Yes, that's something that can really enhance what we're doing in the classroom too, with every student who's in there, to learn more about the different perspectives that people have around the world, just starting with their own classroom, you know, their own peers that they're with. Well, we're almost out of time tonight, and I think it'd be good to end on a kind of a thoughtful note to think what the future might hold. We've got several comments and questions in our Q&A about the need that you've talked about to start language learning early. You know, starting kindergarten, going through 16, going on into post-secondary instruction in the world of work, and making sure that every student, every learner knows that they can be a lifelong language learner. And so we've got comments in here about, you know, how some of our community schools, like the Czech and Slovak School of North Carolina, how they're actually starting to see an increase in the number of adult learners of the language now. And we've got other comments saying, well, look, you know, if we really need our students to be learning languages K-16, why aren't we starting with stronger middle school programs or stronger elementary programs or more dual language immersion programs? And the truth is, we are. You know, we are a local control state, and we are seeing more districts and schools start language instruction earlier and offer things like high school credit classes to middle school students so they can start building that pathway that will lead them into higher level placement, let's say when they reach a university campus, or they'll earn the seal of biliteracy en route to a college. But from your perspective, what do we need to do to really support the idea of a K-16 language learning continuum that would support all of our students from their different linguistic backgrounds?
Educate. educate right now the heads of the North Carolina education system. I think we need to let them know that we cannot continue being a monolinguistic country. And we have been leading, North Carolina has been leading all the time in learning education for the second language. So I think that we need to continue with that legacy. And Marie, you have the power. Tell them, reach them. We have to get out of this monolinguism.
Well, the power we have is the power we have collectively, you know, as a language education community, yes. What needs to happen. Mm-hmm. And so that's one thing we could definitely do is educate. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like not only politicians and policymakers, but also communities, because that's where our students are going to be coming from. So research on successful heritage language maintenance initiatives show that the most successful ones also have community support, and so there's just so much research that supports language learning, and I just think it's important to make that research accessible to people who may not be involved in education or academia. So community events, any type of thing that we can do to have communities and the constituents be the advocates for language learning, I think will help to realize that vision. In my area, if I'm being honest, I see the opposite trend as far as program offerings at the middle school and elementary level. There are fewer than there were when I first came to this particular community, and so I think, it's just without that advocacy and without that pressure from the community, it's harder to keep these programs.
One thing I'm excited about right now is this Biliteracy, the BEST Act. It's the Biliteracy Seon Teaching Act that's currently being considered. That would provide funding, grant opportunities for world language programs across the country. We've often, we were the last content area to receive funding to create national standards. Because we are not, perhaps because we're not a tested subject, we often, receive less attention and less funding. And so this piece of legislation seems like it would be a good opportunity to get some federal funding to help support our programs. And so that's something that is being considered right now. I don't have a lot of details on where it is in the process, but it's something I'd encourage you to look into. And Dr. Gunter, or Dr. Lara, Dr. Randolph, you might be able to say more about that, but supporting federal funding.
Yes, and those are things that we definitely pay attention to. I know, we have a lot of listservs and things like that, and we share information across the board. And you've probably seen some of the things that come from, for example, the work with Congress on the BEST Act or the World Languages Advancement Act. That's another proposal right now in Congress, moving through, it seems like, with bipartisan support. And that's one of the things we definitely pay attention to in K-16 education. So I would encourage you to stay tuned to that. The Joint National Committee of Languages often does a lot of work around that. And here in North Carolina, we share information from that group about what's happening at the federal level, as well as what's happening at the state and even local levels through our listservs and newsletters, so that everyone's informed. Because as we mentioned, if you really want to make a difference in how your language programs are happening, what's being offered, when it's being offered, what grade levels and so forth, since we are a local control state, it's all about mobilizing those policymakers, whether that's a teacher or a principal, a district language coordinator, or your local school board. Those are the folks you can talk to make a change. But there's lots of places to get information from to help you support the need for that and the necessity for that in students' lives to make a difference for them in the long term. And with that, I'm going to draw our conversation to a close. I'm sorry to say, I know we could go on and talk much longer. I thank all of our panelists for being here tonight. This is a very interesting conversation. and hope we can continue it in a variety of ways. I'm going to hand it back to our host, Dr. Fogg, so he can share with us some wrap-up information.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gunter. One of the great frustrations of a Zoom webinar like this is that our fantastic panelists cannot hear the thunderous applause coming from households across North Carolina. I know that I really enjoyed the conversation. I had a lot of notes that I was taking down about the seal of biliteracy. I had a lot of snaps that I was giving to the great answers. So thank you all so much for guiding us through this conversation. For the participants out there who are still with us, you see here the links for the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction World Languages team and for the UNC Duke Area Studies Centers. If you have further questions or problems, feel free to get in touch with me, and you see my email on the screen there. We hope that this was beneficial to you. We hope that this brought you some ideas that you can take back to your classrooms and to your communities. And we hope that we'll be able to have another conversation next year. Thank you so much to our team, and have a great December.